All right. Good morning, everybody. Patrick with First Blood this morning. Except he says, howdy SGM, so I'm assuming His Majesty made a comment before we went live. But good morning. Okay. So this morning I want to talk about the SAVE Act. And it just happens to have popped back up in the news because Fetterman was running his mouth about it. Now, Fetterman is an interesting use case for the conversation. Oh damn, where'd I put the clip? There it is. Whew. For a second there, I thought I'd lost it. It wouldn't have worked out. Fetterman is an interesting use case because it looks like he basically had a stroke and went sane, right? Now, Fetterman is apparently the most reasonable Democrat there is. Now, I bring him up because, there was a time in this country. I know some of the audience is younger, but I know a lot of my audience are my age and older. Got a lot of boomers in the audience. And I know you guys, at least in theory, can remember when it was possible for someone to be a Democrat and not a completely unhinged sociopath. Sadly, those halcyon days are behind us. But Fetterman represents at least a bit of hope that a person can be reasonable. Sergeant Major says he had the money on his back removed. Yeah, in fact, that may actually be what's going on with Fetterman. It may be the case that there are plenty of people who were kind of in his position, who are elected officials, who were elected by Democrats, who are still publicly and visibly psychopaths, more correctly. And Fetterman is sounding a little more sane because he's just not getting the backing that he used to, so he's not quite as beholden to it. Maybe there's something to that. But here you go.
It's unreasonable to show ID just to vote. And I remind everybody.
Let me back that up. I don't want to.
And now, me as a Democrat, I do not believe that it's unreasonable to show ID just to vote. And I remind everybody that less than a year ago in Wisconsin, they added that to the Constitution by a 63%, passing, to put that in the Constitution that you have to show ID to vote. And they also elected a very, very liberal justice into their Supreme Court. So it's not a radical idea for regular Americans to show your ID to vote. And it's absolutely, those things are not Jim Crow or anything. Of course, that's part of an awful, awful legacy of our nation for so long ago. But where we are now, trying to find a way forward.
Now, I want to correct him on something there. Jim Crow is not a legacy of our nation. Jim Crow is a legacy of the Democrat Party. And never forget that. And now, that's not to say anything, that's not to make any moral or ethical claims about Jim Crow generally, but it's important to recall that that is a Democrat legacy, not an American legacy, right? If it were an American legacy, it would have been nationwide. So here's something I want you to understand about voter ID. Like in Georgia, when the voter ID conversation first began, like I'm sure many of you, was surprised we were even having the conversation. Because, of course, in Georgia, I've always had to show my ID, show my driver's license to vote. Every now and then, occasionally I'll get cheeky and show them like my veterans, my VA ID card or my military ID card or my concealed carry card. Even though we don't actually need those in Georgia anymore. But the point is that it has to be a state issued ID card. And you do have to have that to vote in Georgia. Here's something that I find interesting. I've talked about this on the show before, But something I find very interesting is in all of the states where people oppose, where the politicians oppose voter ID, a state ID costs money. In the majority of states that do require voter ID, you can get a non-driver's license state ID at the DMV for free. Just show up, you fill out the paperwork, you prove you are who you are, and you get issued a state ID. And you can use that. A lot of people in Georgia have a state ID that is not a driver's license. It looks like a driver's license. It's produced by the DMV. It says very clearly on it, however, that it is not a license to drive. It is merely a state ID. Those are provided free at the DMV. And, well, you got to have something to collect your welfare benefits. Got to have something to rent a house or buy property, right? You got to show ID to buy alcohol, tobacco, etc. Right? And it is insane that there are people who believe that getting an ID to prove your identity and your citizenship is somehow an onerous burden. But the interesting little twist here, do you know in most states, in all of the major states where they oppose voter ID, right? The states from which come the senators and House reps who are voting against the SAVE Act, it costs $40, $35, $40, $50 to get that state ID from the DMV, the non-driver's license state ID. Now, interestingly, in the courts, the fact that the ID is free in those states which have voter ID has been used as part of the argument to argue that the ID requirement, the requiring people to have state ID, is not a poll tax because the ID is free. So it's literally the case that those states where we see Democrats win consistently and overwhelmingly, they're essentially using the poll tax argument by charging people to acquire an ID to maintain the argument against having ID to vote. And then, despite being, like most of America, about 50-50, they turn in consistently blue at the polls. Right? Every state in America is a little more blue or a little more red, right? But there are no states in America that are just like 100% blue or 100% red. Like we pointed out many times on the show, there are no blue states. There are only blue cities in red states. Every state is mostly red, but that mostly is right around the 50% mark. Some states are, 53, 54, 55% red, or 53, 54, 55% blue. Another great example to look at where there's some shenanigans going on, the state of Virginia, right, is about 50-50. It's like 51 blue, 49 red, and they've just gerrymandered it away so that there is 10-1 House of Representatives. They've just eliminated 4 conservative elected officials by redrawing the district maps and replacing 4 Republican seats with Democrat seats. The demographics didn't change substantially. There was not a sudden shift in public opinion or public support for one party or the other. Nope. They just redrew the map, right? But you look at the county maps across the country, and you'll find that there are not even blue counties. There are blue cities, and then the suburbs around the blue cities tend to be more red. I don't know how many of you guys watched the halftime show. Watched the Super Bowl and saw what the halftime show was about. It's literally the case that there is a move right now in this country to eliminate heritage Americans, to dilute what it means to be an American, to extend the identity of America to include all of South America and Mexico and Canada. And y'all, those are distinct countries with very distinct cultures. And there is a major maneuver by the left, especially, to guarantee that non-Americans are getting to vote in our elections. Even if they can't actually go into the voting booth and pull the lever for their candidate, the mere fact of them being counted in the census without vetting citizenship means that they get representation. It means that representatives and electoral college votes are apportioned to them based on their mere presence, even if unlawful, in this country. I've made the argument before. I'd love to see the census count every single person and take into account which are citizens, which are not. And yeah, I want to see the census come out and say there are this many American citizens. There are this many people in America. 75% are citizens, 20% are non-citizens, and 5% are hostile foreign invaders. I suspect those numbers are a little generous. I'm just pulling that off the top of my head for an example. But total people, citizens, non-citizens, illegals. And frankly, I'd like to know where the non-citizens come from too, because we have some problems, and the H-1B visa problem
trying to call balls
is a big part of that. Now, as we're looking, I've got this post from Janie Johnson. America is exceptional. She says Pennsylvania cheated, Michigan cheated, Georgia cheated, Wisconsin cheated, North Carolina cheated, Arizona cheated, Nevada cheated. Pass the SAVE Act now. I'm not totally up on the news for all of these. Sergeant Major asks, do you think all census workers lay eyes on every person they list as living in a house? I guarantee you they do not. In fact, I am relatively certain that is one of the places that a lot of that corruption happens. Let me backtrack to that for a minute since you asked that question, and point this out as well. The 2020 census was so bad, right? And it's being sold to us that it was ineptitude rather than corruption. But let me see if I can find that breakdown real quick. It's being sold to us as if it was ineptitude instead of corruption, that it wasn't done on purpose. It was just bad math. Show me the alleged overcounting from the 2020 census. How many seats were misapportioned. But in the 2020 census, there were basically a huge drift. According to the Bureau's PES, which is the post-enumeration survey after each decennial census to estimate coverage error, 14 states had statistically significant net undercounts or overcounts in the 2020 census. This is ChatGPT on this, right? So let me close that piece out and I'll zoom in a bit. And look at the states, undercounted states: Arkansas, Florida, Illinois, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas. Oh, all red states. Only red states were undercounted. What about overcounted states who got extra seats? Delaware, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Rhode Island, and Utah. Huh. Isn't that interesting? So is it fair to say that blue states benefited from these counting errors? See what ChatGPT says about that. Says it's partly fair, but only if you say it carefully and precisely. Yes, several blue-leaning states appear to have benefited marginally from 2020 census overcounts, while several red-leaning states appear to have been harmed by undercounts. But there is no proof of intentional manipulation and no seats were legally reapportioned. That is incorrect. That is actually incorrect. Excuse me. That David says bad math with COVID undertones. Yeah. So during the 2020 census just happened to go on during the COVID madness. And that, yeah. Cyber says Dems broke Occam's razor. Oh, well, yes, and they're also playing fast and loose with Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. Well, what we're looking at here, incompetence just does not explain it. Right? It'd be one thing if there were mere errors. The only way incompetence explains those errors consistently benefiting, profiting one party over the other is, the only way incompetence explains that is if the argument you're going to make is, well, Democrats are just less competent than Republicans. And, hey, fair play. In fact, there's a whole canon of evidence to support that claim. That's a whole rabbit hole we could go down. There's not just the conservative leanings of the tradesman, the working man generally, but you can also look at the data that shows us that the majority of left identifying women are currently medicated for some sort of dangerous psychological condition. They're suffering from mental illness severe enough to have been prescribed medication, right? Antipsychotics, SSRIs, etc., by a physician. And the real scary part about that is that means that less than half of them are walking around unmedicated. Now, we look at those numbers, and it is unintelligent to come back and say, "Oh, well, it was just an error. They did a bad job of counting." They did a bad job of counting where the mistake was always and everywhere to the benefit of one party over the other. I'm sorry. What did we say? Was it 14 states? 14 states. So about a quarter of all states, about 25, a little more than 25% of the states had rounding errors, and somehow that all goes in one direction and not the other. Guys, there is no defensible argument there. There just isn't. Now, the more we see, Janie says Pennsylvania cheated, Michigan, Georgia, etc. With Pennsylvania, we don't have to examine any evidence as far as which votes were bad, whether or not they engaged in illegal vote harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. With Pennsylvania, it's as simple as the judges in Pennsylvania changed the voting law in Pennsylvania without the involvement of the legislature. That's not complicated. That is illegal. Pennsylvania committed crime in order to admit additional voters, in order to increase the number of voters. Right? Josh Shapiro was the DA at the time, and he literally said, Donald Trump will not win this election. We will continue to count until he has lost. He said those words. Right? I didn't think I'd get to that this morning, so I don't have that clip pulled up, but we've seen it. I've played it on the show before. He literally said, we will continue to count until Donald Trump has lost, which sounds to me like premeditation. Like I said, the rest of these, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, etc., I'm only passingly familiar with those cases. Of course, I live in Georgia, and in 2020, after the election, I worked as a poll watcher at the recounts. And guys, this is one of those things that just pisses me off so much. You keep hearing people say, "Well, they recounted the votes in Georgia 5 times, and it just and they never found Donald Trump's 11th." Let me tell you what they did when they recounted the votes in Georgia. They took the votes that they had already counted, and they counted them again. Now, that might sound like a recount. And, well, frankly, that is a recount. They took all of the votes that they'd counted, and they counted them again. The allegation was not that the votes were counted incorrectly. The allegation was, and remains, that those votes, that among the votes which were cast in the state of Georgia, that many of them were cast illegally. That was the allegation at the time. And the solution was, well, we're just going to count the votes again. So you're gonna count the illegal votes again. And that's what they did. They counted the legal and illegal votes again. They recounted them. Now, it is not an allegation. It is no longer an allegation. It is, and bear in mind, right? Normally when we talk about something going from being an allegation to being proved, we're talking about the court case having gone through. Now, where we're at right now is Tulsi and Patel and the FBI, and apparently the DNI is involved now too, have collected the evidence from Georgia about the evidence relating to the 2020 election fraud. They've gone in and collected the ballots, which are required to be retained for 7 years. And oh shit, cutting it close. But more importantly, we have the Fulton County Board of Elections admitting that at least 300,000 ballots in an election that was won by a mere 11,000 in that county, or I'm sorry, in the state of Georgia, right? That Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by 11,000 votes. Fulton County, a single county in the state of Georgia, illegally counted no less than 300,000. And it looks like the number is actually 500,000. And the county elections board has admitted in an official statement that that occurred. So it is no longer an allegation. 2020 was stolen. And it was stolen through a multitude of mechanisms, no one of which was sufficient to alter the entire election. That's the thing that I keep coming back to that people don't understand. I didn't mean to get off on the whole 2020 thing again, talking about the SAVE Act, and the SAVE Act is not going to solve all of these problems. All the SAVE Act does is it mitigates one of the many, many vectors through which the Democrat Party and their foreign allies, who are the enemies of the United States of America, manipulate the political system in this country. It's that simple. And it is no longer a theory or an allegation that 2020 was stolen. It is a brute fact. And no intelligent person can make an argument to the contrary. They simply cannot. No person making an argument to the contrary can be said simultaneously to be intelligent and informed on the topic. That's just not an option. And I'm gonna have to go ahead and put it. I'm gonna go ahead and put a pin in it there. So, because I'm just gonna keep going down rabbit holes at this rate if I don't wrap it up and get on down the road to handle business. So, thanks for watching this morning, guys. We love you, and we will see you tomorrow.